Hi friends, it's Andrew here from Nature's Image Photography with another video in my Photography School series where I break down the settings and skills of manual photography into bite-sized pieces that are easy to understand. This time we're going to take a look at one of the big ones. It's all about aperture. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe for more videos coming up in this series and my entire world of photography. Way back in video 2 of this series, I introduced the exposure triangle, which outlines the three major settings we use to control the exposure. Those are the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. In my video on shutter speed, I explained that the shutter is like a black window. When we press the button, the window opens to let light reach the sensor. The shutter speed is the duration of the exposure, or the length of time the window stays open. The aperture is like having a curtain over that window. It can be opened wide to let in more light or closed down to let in less. So if the shutter speed controls the duration, the aperture controls the intensity of the light coming through the window to reach the sensor. Of course, it's not really like a curtain, it's more like the iris in your eye. Here you can see the aperture opening and closing on an old film lens. These days everything's electronic, but back in the old days this is how we did it. Obviously when the aperture's open it lets in more light, and when it's smaller it lets in less. There's one important thing you've probably noticed already. The aperture is not in the camera, it's in the lens. And lenses are not all built the same. So if you own a DSLR camera with a few different lenses, you'll probably find that each one has a slightly different range of aperture settings. Not only that, but on a zoom lens, the aperture range often changes as you zoom the lens in and out. On this 45mm lens, the aperture starts at f1.8. On this 100 to 400mm zoom lens, the aperture starts at f4, but only at the 100mm end. When I zoom it to 400mm, the aperture starts at f6.3. So when you work with a few different lenses, or even the same zoom lens, don't panic when some of those numbers you thought were there seem to disappear. Now before we go any further, I'd better explain what those numbers are all about. Aperture settings are also called f-stops. So when I say the settings on a photo were f5.6 at a 200th of a second, the f5.6 was the aperture setting used for that photo. It's impossible to put up a slide that represents every aperture range on every lens because they are all different. So while you will find most of these f-stop numbers on the lens currently on your camera, you may not find them all. For example, one lens might go from f2.8 to 22, another one might go from f4 to 32. A particular zoom lens might go from f4 to 32 when you zoom it one way, but change to f5.6 to 45 when you zoom it the other way. The f-stop numbers I'm showing you here are old-fashioned settings that have been on cameras for years. Each change in the settings from one to the next was what we used to call a full stop change in the aperture. But these days, as things get more high-tech, apertures go up in partial stops, often a third of a stop at a time. So instead of going from f5.6 to f8, it might go from f5.6 to 6.3 to 7.1 to f8. The trouble is, those increments can change from camera to camera and also on a zoom lens as you zoom it in and out. So really, I just want you to be aware that while I'm showing you a typical range of aperture settings here, there are a lot of variables to keep your eye on. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the f-stop numbers, and it might seem a bit confusing, so to make a long story short, the f-stop relates to the size of the aperture is built into the lens, and all lenses are different. Now comes the part that really matters, and for many beginners this is the hardest part of photography to get your head around. That may seem like bad news right now, but look on the bright side. Once you've mastered this, everything else is going to be easy by comparison. The numbers are backwards. That means as the f-stop number gets bigger, the size of the aperture gets smaller. The numbers are actually fractions of the diameter of a circle, so if you're good with maths, that explains why the hole gets smaller as the number gets bigger. But if, like me, you're hopeless with maths, it's simply something that gets easier with experience. What matters is that the smallest f-stop number lets in the most amount of light, and the biggest f-stop number lets in the least. So hypothetically, if you took a photo at f11 and it came out too dark, you could make it brighter by changing the aperture to f8 or 5.6. If it came out too bright, you could darken it down by changing to f16 or 22. Okay, so I know this seems like an awful lot of numbers, but the great news is you really don't need to be a great numbers person to be able to use aperture to control your exposure. If you know how to read your light meter, which I explained in part 3 of the series, then making the link between aperture and exposure gets much easier. Remember, on your light meter the centre point is what the camera calls a correct exposure. Plus means brighter or overexposed, minus means darker or underexposed. So if you turn your aperture dial one way and you see the light meter move towards the plus, then you know the aperture is getting bigger because it's letting in more light. If it moves towards the minus, then you know the aperture must be getting smaller. Here you can see it in action on the back screen of my Pentax DSLR. I've circled the f-stop and the light meter. Now watch what happens when I turn the aperture dial. As the f-stop number gets smaller, the light meter moves towards the plus because I'm letting in more light. When I turn the dial the other way, the f-stop number gets bigger and the light meter moves in the opposite direction. We already know from the previous videos that the shutter speed gives us a quick and easy way of controlling the exposure. By adding the aperture, we now have 2 ways to control exposure. And if you always remember to keep your eye on the light meter, you can use either or both of these settings to make sure your photo is exactly as bright or as dark as you want it to be. In my next video in the series, I'm going to take a closer look at how we control exposure using aperture and shutter speed combined. Let's take another look at my short video clip. Notice that I'm changing the aperture setting by turning the rear dial on the camera with my thumb. This is another thing that varies from camera to camera. Many cameras have 2 separate dials for the aperture and the shutter speed. Some have the aperture at the front and the shutter speed at the back. Some, like mine, have the shutter speed at the front and the aperture at the back. And just to add to the fun, some cameras only have 1 dial to operate both. If your camera has only 1 dial, look for the exposure compensation button, which has a little plus minus symbol on it. When you're shooting in manual mode, which is what this series is all about, you change your shutter speed by simply turning the dial, but you change the aperture by turning the dial while also holding down the plus minus button. I'm sorry I can't be much more help than that. You're going to have to work out for yourself which of these options best describes your camera. Now we come to the final important point I want to make about aperture, and that's how it relates to depth of field. I explained depth of field in my previous video in this series, so if you don't know what depth of field is all about, be sure to check that one out. In that video I showed you that a smaller f-stop number, wider aperture, creates a shallow depth of field, and a larger f-stop number creates a stronger depth of field. Let's take a look at that in action with this little macro series. For each new shot I reduced the size of the aperture by a stop, remembering that as the number gets bigger, the aperture gets smaller. And you can see what happens to that depth of field as the background just gets clearer and clearer with each new shot. It can be a bit subtle when we go one stop at a time like this, but the difference is really stark when you see where we started and where we finished. Note that you won't see such a big difference with landscape photography, because when you're further away from the subject with a wide-angle lens, the depth of field will be strong no matter what you do. But for close-up work like this that lends itself to a shallower depth of field, what you do with your aperture is going to make a huge difference to the look of each photo. So that's the story of apertures and f-stops. I'm sorry this video has been a lot of numbers and not too many photos. I did say at the start that for some beginners aperture is the hardest setting to come to terms with, simply because those numbers are a bit messy. The truth is, it's really not that hard, and with a small amount of practice you'll find it makes sense pretty quickly. To make a long story short, a small f-stop number gives you a wider aperture, more light for a brighter exposure, and less depth of field. A larger f-stop number gives you a smaller aperture, less light for a darker exposure, and more depth of field. It all boils down to 2 main factors. There's the technical side, where aperture is used to control how bright or how dark your photo is, and there's the creative side, where it affects how much of your photo is in and out of focus. With a small amount of practice, you're going to find that understanding aperture makes a huge difference to your photography. Of course, it has to be said that aperture can't be seen in isolation. To really control your exposure, you need to know how aperture works hand in hand with shutter speed. But that's going to be the subject of my next photography school video, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you go. For now, I'm Andrew Goodall, this is Nature's Image Photography, thanks for watching.